I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we analyse the latest tactical and strategic news from the war and look at Boris Johnson's address to the Ukrainian parliament.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 3rd of May, day 69, and today I'm joined by Defence and Security Editor Dominic Nicholls and Deputy Foreign Editor Theo Mers. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from the front line.
Hi David, hi everybody. It's been a weekend of a contested front line, the line of control through the Donbass and across the south. It carries on the movement of last week when there was a lot of sort of push and pull, small tactical successes, particularly in the centre of the Donbass by Russia, where they finally seem to have got their combined arms manoeuvre together. They are operating under a barrage, under an umbrella, if you like, of artillery. But what that means is that they're only moving forward at about 2 to 3 kilometres a day. That figure was given by Western officials and by US Department of Defence officials. So 2 to 3 kilometres a day, not ideal at all. In the north, Russia's under extreme pressure. Ukraine has had continued their success from last week around Kharkiv to the north and to the east, putting huge pressure on that line, that logistic supply line down from the Russian border down into the Donbass. So it would be very interesting to watch that area to see if Ukraine are able to cut off that resupply route, which is a massive ask, actually. They said themselves it would take about a brigade, with about a brigade's worth in reserve. So a huge ask. But if they were able to cut that line or force Russia to use routes further round to the east, that would be a significant advantage there. In the south, more pressure around Mykolaiv and Kherson, and there have been the very, very small number of evacuations from the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. I mean, only yesterday 100, we're told 100 got out and they're en route now to Zaporizhia, should be arriving today, sort of lunchtime-ish today, if not early afternoon. They may already be there. That was brokered by the UN. But that's a very small number. There's thought to be hundreds of civilians left in the plant and thousands, I mean in tens of thousands, if not over 100,000 civilians left in what's left of Mariupol city. So still very very contested, very very grim, but we can talk a little bit later about quite what this very very slow advance in the centre of the Donbass might mean for Russia. But I'll just pause there.
Before we talk about Boris Johnson's address to the Ukrainian parliament, Theo, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, just following on from what Dom was saying about the evacuations from Mariupol, very small numbers of people, only around 100 going to Ukraine, also around 50 being taken into Russia. And that's particularly tiny in the context of the number of displaced people that we've been talking about over the weekend, or that we've heard about from the Russian side. Of course, we know that millions of refugees have fled Ukraine to the west, to Europe and elsewhere. But over the weekend, Russia said that 1 million people have been, quote unquote, evacuated from largely the east of Ukraine into the Russian Federation. Of course, they have framed this as being for these people's own safety and security, that they want to come to Russia. That they're fleeing the conflict in the same way that others are fleeing to the west. Though Ukraine has earlier said that hundreds of thousands of people are being taken into Russia, the majority of them against their will. They're being taken, some of them used as hostages, might be used as in prisoner exchanges, many of them being taken to what they call filtration camps that are not labour camps and are not comparable to the Gulag or anything like that, but where they're taken before being passed on or sent on into other areas of Russia. Largely, we're hearing economically depressed areas of Russia, where more workers are needed. So in that context, in what else, the other figures we've been hearing from the weekend, the number of evacuations from the steel plant in Mariupol are really, really small.
Thanks, Theo. I'd like to come back later potentially to this issue of forced evacuations from Ukraine, because it's something we've mentioned a few times, and I think there's a lot to say. But firstly, we know that Boris Johnson has just addressed the Ukrainian parliament. What did he say, and how did it go down?
So he's been speaking literally in the last few minutes. The first, as you say, first Western leader to be able to speak to the Ukrainian parliament since the war started on the 24th of Feb. And he's been telling, this is a quote, that though your soldiers were always outnumbered, 3-1 it is now, he says, they fought with the energy and courage of lions. You have beaten them back from Kyiv. You have exploded the myth of Putin's invincibility, and you have written one of the most glorious chapters in military history and in the life of your country. So, you know, stirring stuff, as you'd expect from Boris Johnson. I mean, a skilled orator. Never mind all his other faults, but he speaks exceptionally well. There is criticism here in the UK for our overseas listeners that he's making this speech in the week of some fairly tricky local elections, but it is what it is. He was invited, and he's very, very happy to speak to the Ukrainian Parliament. I mean, it underlines the close international ties, not only between Britain and Ukraine, but also this unwavering support, and long may it continue. So this will go down well in Kyiv. It will go down well in the international community. It will underline yet again for Russia that Britain is just a stooge of the West, and we're the ultimate evil, and we're propping up this Nazi regime. But hey, let them have their fun. They were talking about underwater nuclear missiles explosions at the weekend, so that they have these little flights of fancy. But no, this is good diplomatic stuff, and we should pause and maybe lift our eyes a little bit from domestic politics and say that it's good that a Western leader does this. On the back, of course, last week when Nancy Pelosi, the Democrat leader of the House of Representatives in the US, was in Kyiv meeting Mr. Zelensky and went for a walkabout. So just that steady drumbeat of Western leaders showing overtly showing support can only be a good thing.
And how did it go down in the Verkhovna Rada in the Ukrainian parliament? I can see some of the pictures of standing ovations and parliamentarians holding Union Jacks.
Well, that says it all, really. I mean, the fact that there are now these memes of Saint Enlaw to go alongside Saint Javelin, the anti-tank missiles. This is good diplomatic stuff. It'll play very well for Boris Johnson. He's had a street named after him in Ukraine. So this is good diplomatic stuff. We should pause the domestic political jibes for a moment, if you like, and say I'm pleased to see a world leader doing this.
Anything to add on that, Theo?
Yeah, it's interesting that this is the first time a Western leader has addressed the Ukrainian parliament directly since the start of the conflict, as you say, because we've seen so much of Zelensky addressing parliaments around the world, and as we've mentioned before, always tailoring his speeches to the parliaments that he's speaking to, or the politicians that he's speaking to. In the US, he mentioned Pearl Harbor, I think, when he was speaking to Germans. He talked about the Holocaust, and of course, when he was speaking to the UK, there were echoes of Churchill in his speech, which Boris Johnson has given back in his address to the Ukrainian Parliament, talking about this being Ukraine's finest hour. So we may see more Western leaders now following on and speaking with Ukrainian politicians directly.
And there was also an announcement of a new £300 million package of military aid for Ukraine. Dominic Nichols, can you tell us about that? What's in it, and what could it do?
A new £300 million announcement for a lethal aid. So this includes some electronic warfare equipment, at least a dozen armoured civilian vehicles, which would help with mainly on the humanitarian side. Counter-battery radar, so the Mamba counter-battery radars. This is a radar that sits alongside your artillery batteries and stares at the sky and sees the artillery coming towards it, and can then work out through physics, and thank God I did my O-level physics, I can hang on by my fingertips here, can work out the point of origin of those rounds. So if you're quick enough, you can return fire and hopefully destroy those artillery positions. The defence watcher, defence analyst Nicholas Drummond, I spoke to last week for the long read on artillery in the Telegraph. He said that these days, if you are not moving, if you're not shooting and scooting, and you're gone from your position within 180 seconds, so 3 minutes, you can expect return fire to land where you are. So the counter-battery radars are absolutely critical for that, and it also shows how self-propelled artillery is also the equipment you want to go for, rather than necessarily the towed artillery like the American M777, very, very useful, very powerful, but anything that needs to be hitched up and moved and can't move under its own steam is always going to be at a slight disadvantage. But that's interesting. The Mamba counter-battery radar, thousands of night vision devices, and we've spoken before about this curious happenstance that Russia just seems to not want to fight at night. It just doesn't seem to have the night vision devices across its personnel and vehicles, including air vehicles, to have a coordinated effect at night. So that's very interesting. That not only that they are not, but that's another small area where Ukraine might have the slight tactical advantage, and also drones. And this was interesting. This talk of drones for logistical resupply. Now this is an idea that's come around for the last few years about having unattended ground vehicles as well as unattended air vehicles, and actually surface and subsurface underwater vehicles as well, getting drones to do resupply, so just physically carrying ammunition or medical supplies or food and water, petrol or lubricants, that kind of thing, and also possibly bringing out casualties. So it's an interesting development in recent years, and of course there's no reason why drones should be excluded from this area of research, and they're not. So I've been speaking to Keith Deere, who's the boss of Airbridge Aviation. They've been involved with this for a little while, and what they've been suggesting is they did some work with the US Air Force, actually repurposing Predator C for Syria for logistic resupply or humanitarian aid for Syria, and they changed it from Pred C to Angel 1, almost literally the drone equivalent of turning swords into plowshares. Other areas of research, I know BAE Systems have been looking at this, DARPA have been looking at this, and it's an area ripe for development. So Airbridge Aviation, Mr. Deere, Keith Deere's company, they've been working with various partners. They're looking at the two vehicles in particular, the Air Environment T20, which is a smaller drone, can carry about sort of 30 kilograms of material. Not a huge amount, but if you keep it going all night and they're fairly quiet, and if you can't see them, they've got a low radar cross section, so they're hopefully not going to get shot out of the sky. You can over time bring in a lot of resupply. They're also looking at a company called Singular Aircraft that make the Flyox 1. This is much larger, so this carries about 1,000 kilograms at a time, and then you're into serious numbers. So you can really take a lot of move a lot of kit around. Obviously, the bigger it is, the more obvious it is to anyone who might want to stop it getting there. But it shows the development pathway. And of course, the thing to do is if the airframes themselves are fairly cheap and easier to produce. I know they're never easy to produce, but you could then come to a decision if you have aid flowing in. You could come to a decision about whether you want this stuff to come back. So what I mean is, look at Mariupol, look at the Avastal plant there. If you had an aircraft like the Flyox 1, which can take about a ton of stores, if you just flew it there, straight to the X, flew it into the ground, crashed it, you're not going to bring it back. I mean, you're much more likely to get it there because you don't have to evade Russian air defences on the way out again. And if it's heavy stuff, as in ammunition, you could just fly it straight to the defenders. Medical equipment and what have you might be a bit more fragile. But the point I'm making is this is a whole new area of research that had a little bit of a look in Syria and in recent years and other sort of humanitarian responses, but particularly in Syria in a conflict zone, and then they're now being boosted. It's kind of on steroids. So this new money from the UK that the Prime Minister announced, some of it will go into this research, and it's just ripe for exploitation. I chatted to Keith there. He said he hopes this is going to catalyse innovation in the sector, and I think it absolutely will. So drone resupply, humanitarian and potentially lethal military aid, an area to watch, I'd suggest.
Thanks, Tom. That's absolutely fascinating. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Theo, and if not, no worries. I thought that was very comprehensive. And then we can talk a little bit about this diplomatic row between Russia and Israel.
Yes, this is because over the weekend, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said that being Jewish is sort of no guard against anti-Semitism, and he said this because Zelensky himself has Jewish heritage, and this has been a fairly obvious attack line against Russia when it says that its aim is to denazify Ukraine, but people rightly pointing out that the leader of the country is Jewish, which makes this idea particularly bizarre. So yes, Lavrov at the weekend said that just because he's Jewish doesn't mean that he or his officials are not anti-Semitic, and he suggested that Hitler was part Jewish. To back this up, Israel obviously extremely angry about that comparison, calling in the Russian ambassador. And Israel and Russia traditionally have closer relations than Russia and many other Western countries. That's partly because there's such a large ethnically Russian or Russian-speaking population in Israel, many refugees and emigres from the Soviet Union there. So Israel's leadership needs to keep that Russian population on side as well as other areas of mutual interest in the Middle East. So that is, it may have alienated or Russia may have alienated if not exactly a partner, but at least one country that wasn't going so far to condemn its actions in Ukraine.
Thanks, Theo. And there's also, I thought, rather interesting news from an economics perspective that Slovakia is going to try and seek an exemption from any oil embargo of Russia. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, it seems like we're moving closer to an embargo, and why is Slovakia doing what it's doing?
Well, it's Slovakia and Hungary that have both said that, or reportedly said that they would avoid any embargo coming from the EU, and that's because they're both so reliant on Russian energy in the case of Slovakia and Hungary, and in the case of Hungary, it's because they're politically closer to Russia. Orban has in the past aligned himself with Putin. They have similar cultural. Or similar, in some ways, political agendas, similar cultural agendas, both very anti-LGBT, very culturally conservative politicians that in some ways have set themselves up against Western liberalism. And it's interesting, this division, I suppose, within the EU about how to respond to Russia in an ongoing way. And even today or earlier over the weekend, officials in Kiev were alleging, we don't know whether this is true or not, that Putin informed Hungary of his plans to invade Ukraine in advance and suggested that Hungary might be able to take a part of Ukrainian territory. I mean, this is just what Ukrainian officials are saying. It does seem slightly far-fetched, this idea that Russia offered Hungary a chance to carve up Ukraine. But there's certainly this idea that there are, within Ukraine, that there are countries that are warmer or more supportive, such as the UK, hence Boris Johnson being invited to speak to the Ukrainian parliament today, and then other countries in Eastern Europe like Hungary and Slovakia that are looking for ways to work around sanctions and work around embargoes against Russia. And it'll be interesting to see how those divisions develop or whether they can be reconciled.
Thanks, Theo. I thought that was very comprehensive. Dom Nichols, can we go back to what you were saying about some of the strategic and tactical analysis from the current fighting across the line of control? We had a very interesting article in The Telegraph that said that in the Russian retreat from Kharkiv, they were particularly casualty averse, displaying casualty aversion. What does that mean, and what does that show us about Russia's advance at the moment?
Well, casualty aversion, as the phrase suggests, is an unwillingness to, or fear. I mean, once you cross from unwillingness to fear in a military force, you've got big problems, because, I mean, nobody wants to be a casualty. No one wants to take casualties as a commander, but it's an inevitability, and part of your responsibility as a commander at any level is to not unnecessarily risk the lives of the men and women in your charge. And if there's a lack of belief in those that are doing the fighting, that those coming up with the plans are not making that a very, very high priority, or simply not good at their job, then it drains morale. It absolutely saps the will to go forwards. If you're not sure of the people behind you, as in the command structure, and you have your doubts about the people to your left and your right, if they are newly sort of produced conscripts or new reserves. I mean, they might be fantastic. I served with some very, very capable reservists in my military career. So just being a reservist in and of itself is not a bad thing. But it's the quality control mechanism that you're not sure of. And if you're not entirely sure, you get a new bunch of fresh troops in, because you've been fighting hard now for 6 weeks. You get a new bunch in. You're not sure who they are, or if they're any good, if you can rely on them, etc., etc. And once that seed of doubt enters your mind, it just puts a slight halt to your advance. It makes the boots a little bit heavier when you're going forward. And if that belief takes hold in a unit or formation, and you become casualty averse, so you are no longer primarily thinking about what you're going to do to the enemy, but you're thinking about what the enemy can do to you, then you've lost the psychological edge to go forwards and to take ground, and that is catastrophic for a fighting force. Now, we've been at this thing since February the 24th. Those who have actually been doing it, I'm thinking, the Russian soldiers, they will have literally first-hand experience of what's been going on. They will have, I would have thought, all of them. Maybe that's a bit much, but the vast majority will have entertained the idea that either their army is not quite as good as they thought it was going to be, or the Ukrainians are much better than they were expecting, or a bit of both. And they might now be thinking, is this such a good idea? And if you put all these things together, doubts about your ability, the people around you, doubts that the opposition aren't going to be quite the walkover you expected and you were told they were going to be, combined with not really trusting your superiors, not feeling that they've got your best interests at heart. And your best interest is not always to not go into combat. Sometimes you've got to be aggressive in these actions. Otherwise, to roll backwards is sometimes the worst thing you can do. So if you have all these doubts playing on your mind, and it stymies your advance, and you're looking for someone else to take the initiative, and they're looking for someone else, and they're looking for someone else, then it just grinds everything to a halt. We've seen this. We've seen evidence of this since day one, really. I mean, remember we were talking about why were so many Russian generals getting killed, and the suggestion was that they had to go forward to impose their personality on the battlefield and on the operations to get people going. Literally, there's only so much you can do via radio and via sort of trust in the chain of command. Sometimes the commander needs to go forward and start sort of, giving it the blood and guts. And it seems like we're now seeing that on a broader scale in the Donbass. lend itself more to manoeuvre, to physical movement, being able to use your military forces rather than just sticking to defined and paved routes. Russia seems reluctant to get off those paved surfaces. The ground is better. It's not ideal yet for cross-country manoeuvre, but it's better. So they should be able to put together a more impressive operational performance, whereas we've seen very, very tactical advances. Like I say, Western officials, the US DoD, are saying 2 or 3 kilometres a day. I mean, this is not the breakthrough that they should be able to achieve, even if, as has been suggested, they've been feeding in the reconstituted troops piecemeal. That was the quote given by officials, rather than having newly trained, newly formed units and formations. So it suggests that they're not at the strength they would wish. The heavy use of artillery is what we'd expect from Russia doctrinally, but also suggests that it's kind of making up for a little bit of movement. So if you're not moving on the ground, it's very easy or it's very the next best thing is to try and hold that position through the use of artillery and other indirect fire. And so it all speaks of this advance, this push, this main objective in the Donbass kind of running out of steam. It's far too early to say. It's been somewhat pegged by the response from, by the staunch response from the Ukrainian forces, but by some of the equipment that's now flowing in from the west. That's not all there yet, or the heavy artillery is not all there yet. But at the moment, it looks like Ukraine are holding. They are ceding ground for tactical advantage, or for operational advantage, I should say, allowing the small tactical successes in order to move to better positions. So Russia are not making the advances that they really should be, and they have demonstrated in some area limited tactical success. So the fact that's not carried out across the whole force does speak of that something else is at play, and it could be this idea of being casualty averse. I don't think the commanders will be. They've not necessarily shown themselves to care that much about the human cost in their actions, but they've also shown themselves to be not very good at planning military operations. So yes, we could be seeing a reluctance at the very front from those troops doing the fighting to advance, and if that is the case, then that is very, very serious for Russia.
Thanks very much, Dom. I've got a couple of questions from listeners, and I think this can go to both Theo and Dom. This is a question, I don't have the name unfortunately, but our correspondent writes, as awful as it may sound, given satellite imagery, etc., why wouldn't the Russians make a more determined plan to cover up mass graves? I think this is in reference to the numerous pictures we've seen over the last few weeks of allegations of mass graves dug near Mariupol. What do you make of that?
I think they haven't made more of an effort to hide it, because how Russia is explaining this, Russia doesn't care how the West perceives this war. If it cared at all what the West was going to say or do, it wouldn't have invaded. It cares how a domestic audience perceives it, and how they see it is, or how these massacres in places like Bucha are reported to them, are either as Western fakes, that it's the UN or the US going in there with bodies of people already dead and sort of laying them out on the floor to take pictures and frame Russia and set Russia up as this international bogeyman, or they're saying that Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian neo-Nazis did this, and so it justifies their own invasion. So I think that it's a good question, but it sort of misunderstands how Russia reports this war and what it cares about here, and it knows that Russian state media, the Kremlin, know that they will be able to spin this in ways that make it palatable to the domestic audience, and there are relatively few Russians, especially now that so much independent and online media has been shut down or blocked in Russia. There are relatively few Russians that are getting their news from Western sources or independent sources, and they're getting it all from state media, where there's more or less rolling coverage of how any atrocities are caused by Ukrainian Nazis or by the West fighting a proxy war. So I would say that is why they're not making more of an effort to cover up what's going on.
Thanks, Theo. Anything to add to that, Dom?
Well, I was just going to say, I think Theo's hit it on the head there. It's under the banner of they don't really care, but also the audience that they do care about, the domestic Russian opinion, they just won't have access to this stuff, and the little bits that they might find is through the prism of state media, which will blame someone else or deny it. Very, very few people will actually have access to information such as we do over here. So, no, I think it's under the banner of it's just not that important to them. It's not a priority.
Do either of you have anything to add from developments over the weekend that we haven't talked about yet?
Just want to finish up. Last week we were talking about this visit of General Valery Gerasimov, the head of the whole Russian armed forces, who was sent down to Ukraine. We weren't sure if he was going to take command of the operation or if it was a morale boosting visit or quite what it was. But it now seems like he did go down for a few days last week. Accompanied to that, there seems to have been a glaring operational security faux pas, if you like, from Russia, because the headquarters that he visited just south of Izium was hit by Ukrainian multiple launch rocket system attack. A number of casualties, including the 10th Russian general to be killed, General Simonov, who was an electronic warfare specialist. Gerasimov, there were reports that Gerasimov was injured. I don't think that was correct. It was suggested that he was hit in the leg by shrapnel. I don't think that is correct. And he was believed to have flown back to Belgorod that afternoon, so Belgorod inside Russia, and then from there back up to Moscow. But the reports of him visiting almost certainly true. The reports of that meeting being hit by Ukraine, we think is credible and true as well. We don't think that Gerasimov was injured, but it does, as I say, it just underlines the OPSEC issues, the operational security issues of that Russia seemed to be having.
Thanks, Tom. Anything from you, Theo, or shall we go to your final thoughts of what to look for and what we should be aware of in the coming week?
My other thing from the weekend is the thing that we'll be looking out for this week. So I'll do both of those at the same time. I'm really interested in these 1 million people who have left Ukraine to go into Russia, and I really want to know what they are doing and where they are now. And that's certainly something that we're looking into, and there has been some reporting about that in the Western media, and of course some in Russian state media, saying that they all were desperate to come to Russia from terrible Nazified Ukraine and are having a much better time in Russia. So it would be good to get some independent reporting on that. And it's something that we're going to be pursuing on the foreign desk and with our correspondents. But I think this story, perhaps more than anything, has really brought it home to me how hard it is to cover what is happening inside Russia now without correspondents in the country. And this has happened, as you know, this happened a couple of months ago, or about 6 weeks ago, that our Moscow correspondent had to leave along with almost all other Western media after Moscow brought in a new law that can jail journalists for up to 15 years for spreading fake news about the war effort. Obviously, the Russian definition of fake news about the war effort is extremely broad, and that's done for our journalists' own safety, and most other organisations have made similar calls. There are very few Western journalists there, but it just means it's really, really hard, obviously, to work out what is actually going on and where these people are and what is happening to them now. So we're going to try our best with contacts on the ground, with reporting remotely, and I hope build up a much fuller picture of where those people are now.
Well, do come back and talk to us again when we have that, because I know that's a subject that we're getting lots of questions on from listeners. So thank you very much, Theo. And we look forward to hearing more on that. Dom, would you like the final words this week?
Thank you. I'm going to be watching the strategic messaging coming out of Moscow this week. We've got May the 9th coming up. Not many days left. Almost certainly not going to be... Putin's not going to talk in terms of any kind of victories anywhere, but we've talked about how he might use it to broaden the war or explain that it is a war and then call for mass mobilisation and so on and so forth. So this week will be, I'm expecting more messaging. But at the same time, Russia, yet again over the weekend, as we mentioned at the start of this, has shown that they just keep getting it wrong. I mean, this stuff Lavrov was saying about Hitler and Nazis and Zelensky and all the rest of it. I mean, they've just alienated Israel, a country, as we mentioned before, had been a bit cool about how to respond to this war so far. And if Russia had played it a bit more, been a bit more cute about it, they could have found a soft ally there. And they've got it wrong again. And I just find it extraordinary that Lavrov's been around probably for too long. I think and the whole establishment there, I think it's just old. It's tired. It just doesn't know how to move with the times, with the speed and pace that things are happening today. They're just sticking to these old lines of Nazis, and they're going to set off a nuke underwater. And I was like, oh, come on, guys, can you come up with something better than that? And I just don't think they can. So I'm going to keep a good eye out on the strategic messaging this week in the run up to May the 9th. But I'm really not expecting anything particularly sensational.
Just quickly before we finish, Dom, I know you've been reading that RUSI report about what May the 9th may contain. Are we any closer to understanding what Putin might say?
Well, no is the short answer. I think he's going to play it very close to his chest and try and sniff the political wind. Horrible expression, I do apologise. In the run up to May the 9th. So no, I think he will couch it in a very positive way, whatever he says. But like I say, I think they are behind the curve here. They don't have the initiative. I mean, if there's a parade through Kyiv on May the 9th of Ukrainian tractors, I mean, how is Russia going to respond to that? It's a brilliant piece of trolling. I really hope it happens. Then how are they going to respond? I can't see how Putin is going to frame this in any way to be a positive. But no, what he's going to say, we don't know. But I think it will be fairly tired, fairly old hat, and we'll just look at it and go, yeah, okay, same old.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Alice Hearing.